The humid summer air of August 1950 hung heavy over the southeastern tip of Korea, as Colonel Charles Smith watched the dust clouds rising on the horizon. Behind him, the port city of Pusan buzzed with desperate activity, the last major stronghold preventing complete communist domination of the Korean peninsula. Ahead, somewhere beyond those rolling hills, an entire North Korean army was advancing with the confidence of conquerors who had swept everything before them for 2 months. Smith adjusted his field glasses and studied the terrain that would either become his army's graveyard or the place where the tide of war finally turned. The Pusan perimeter, as military planners had dubbed this rectangular defensive zone, stretched roughly 100 miles north to south and 50 miles east to west. It was all that remained of free Korea, a cramped sanctuary where American, British, Turkish, and South Korean forces had been compressed like a spring, waiting to see if they would snap or rebound. The colonel's radio man approached with urgent messages from 8th Army headquarters. General Walton Walker's orders were clear and desperate. "There will be no more retreating. We fight or die here." The words carried the weight of 2 months of continuous withdrawal, of cities abandoned and positions overrun, of an enemy that seemed unstoppable in its southern advance. Just 3 months earlier, the world had watched in shock as North Korean People's Army forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950. President Harry Truman's decision to commit American forces under United Nations auspices had been swift, but the military response had been anything but smooth. Task Force Smith, the first American unit to engage the enemy, had been mauled at Pusan on July 5th. Since then, it had been a story of retreat after retreat. Taijeon, Taegu, dozens of smaller towns and strategic positions falling like dominoes before the North Korean onslaught. According to military historian Roy Appelman's comprehensive account in South to the Naktong, North to the Yalu, the situation by early August 1950 had become so critical that some American officials in Washington seriously considered complete evacuation from the peninsula. The North Korean People's Army, led by experienced commanders who had fought alongside Chinese Communist forces, numbered over 90,000 well-equipped troops, supported by Soviet tanks and artillery. Now compressed into this final defensive perimeter around Pusan, the United Nations command faced its moment of truth. The Naktong River formed the western boundary of the perimeter, while the Taebaek Mountains provided some protection to the north. To the east lay the Sea of Japan, offering the only escape route, or the final trap, depending on how the next few weeks unfolded. Smith lowered his binoculars and turned to address his staff officers. These men, many of whom had fought in World War II, understood the gravity of their situation. Unlike the previous war, where American industrial might and vast distances had provided strategic advantages, Korea offered no room for maneuver, no time for mobilization, no margin for error. The sound of distant artillery rumbled across the countryside, growing closer each day. Refugees continued streaming into the perimeter, their faces etched with the trauma of a nation torn apart. Among them walked soldiers from the Republic of Korea Army, some still carrying weapons, others having lost everything except their determination to defend their homeland. As night fell over the perimeter, Smith reflected on the irony of their situation. Here, at the very edge of defeat, the United Nations forces would finally have the advantage they had lacked throughout the retreat: concentrated firepower, shortened supply lines, and the desperation that transforms ordinary soldiers into heroes. The Battle of Pusan perimeter was about to begin, and with it, the fight that would prove whether democracy could survive against communist expansion in the Cold War era. Lieutenant General Walton Harris Walker stood before the situation map in his command bunker, the harsh fluorescent lights casting deep shadows across his weathered face. Red arrows marked North Korean positions advancing from multiple directions, each representing thousands of enemy soldiers pushing against the shrinking perimeter. The date was August 6, 1950, and the intelligence reports painted a picture that would have terrified lesser commanders. The North Korean People's Army had deployed 13 divisions around the Pusan perimeter, with more arriving daily. Their 4th Division pressed against the northern sector near Pohang, while the 6th Division threatened the crucial Nakhtong River line. Most dangerous of all, the elite 3rd Division, veterans of the Chinese Civil War, had positioned themselves for a decisive assault on Taegu, the communications hub that connected all defensive positions. Walker's forces, though reinforced by arriving American units, remained critically outnumbered. The 24th Infantry Division, bloodied from 2 months of retreating combat, held positions along the Nakhtong River. The 25th Infantry Division defended the northern approaches, while the 1st Cavalry Division, fighting as infantry, protected the eastern sector. British forces from the 27th Brigade and Turkish troops added their strength to the multinational defense. The general's aide approached with the latest casualty reports. American losses since the beginning of the conflict had been staggering, over 6,000 casualties in less than 2 months. Many units were operating at half strength, their ranks filled with hastily trained replacements who had never seen combat. The South Korean forces, though brave and motivated, lacked the heavy equipment and training to stand against Soviet-supplied North Korean armor. Intelligence reports indicated that the North Korean High Command, confident in their numerical superiority, planned a coordinated assault from multiple directions. Their strategy was simple, but potentially devastating: overwhelm the defenders at several points simultaneously, preventing the United Nations forces from shifting reserves to threatened sectors. If successful, this offensive would collapse the entire perimeter and drive the remaining UN forces into the sea. Walker knew that conventional military wisdom suggested his position was hopeless. Military textbooks taught that successful defense required depth, multiple prepared positions that could absorb enemy attacks while preserving the main force. The Pusan perimeter offered no such luxury. His troops occupied a thin crust around the southeastern corner of Korea, with the ocean at their backs and nowhere to retreat. Yet Walker also understood advantages that the North Koreans might underestimate. For the first time since the war began, American air power could operate effectively. The 5th Air Force, flying from Japanese bases and the airstrip at Pohang, dominated the skies over the perimeter. Navy carriers in the Sea of Japan provided additional strike capability, their aircraft ranging far behind enemy lines to disrupt supply convoys and communications. Naval gunfire represented another crucial asset. Destroyers and cruisers positioned offshore could deliver devastating, accurate fire against any enemy forces approaching the eastern sectors of the perimeter. The narrow confines that limited Walker's maneuver room also meant that every square mile of battlefield lay within range of naval artillery. The supply situation, paradoxically, had improved dramatically since the retreat ended. Pusan's port facilities, the best in Korea, allowed rapid unloading of equipment and reinforcements arriving from Japan and the United States. Ammunition stocks, critically low during the retreat, now reached adequate levels for sustained combat. As reports arrived from forward observers, Walker traced the enemy movements on his map. North Korean forces were massing for attacks at multiple points: the Nakhtong Bulge, where the river bent closest to Pusan, the mountain passes north of Taegu, and the coastal approaches near Pohang. Each thrust aimed at a vital sector. Each represented a potential breakthrough that could unravel the entire defense. The general's radio crackled with reports from regimental commanders. Colonel John Michaelis of the 27th Infantry Regiment reported increased enemy activity across from his positions along the Nakhtong River. Colonel Harold Moore of the 8th Cavalry Regiment described massive troop concentrations building up north of Taegu. Every sector commander reported the same ominous signs: the calm before the storm. Walker issued final preparation orders to his division commanders. Artillery units received priority target lists. Air liaison officers coordinated close support missions. Medical units prepared for mass casualties. Engineers strengthened defensive positions and prepared bridges for demolition, if retreat became necessary. As dawn approached on August 7, 1950, both armies prepared for the climactic battle that would determine Korea's fate. The North Korean People's Army, confident in their numerical superiority and recent victories, planned to deliver the knockout blow that would drive their enemies into the sea. The United Nations forces, compressed into their final defensive positions, prepared to prove that courage, firepower, and determination could overcome overwhelming odds. The pre-dawn darkness of August 12, 1950, shattered with the thunder of North Korean artillery. Colonel Paul Freeman felt the ground tremble beneath his feet as enemy shells crashed into the positions of his 23rd Infantry Regiment along the Naktong River. Through his field glasses, he watched muzzle flashes wink like deadly fireflies across the water as North Korean forces launched their long-awaited offensive. The first battle of the Naktong Bulge had begun, marking the opening phase of what would become the most critical engagement of the Korean War. Freeman's men, dug into positions along the riverbank, faced the veteran 4th Division of the North Korean People's Army, troops who had fought their way down the peninsula with devastating effectiveness. As the artillery barrage lifted, Freeman heard the distinctive sound that chilled every American soldier, the grinding of tank tracks. Soviet-built T-34 medium tanks, nearly invulnerable to American bazookas, emerged from the morning mist like prehistoric monsters. Behind them came waves of North Korean infantry, their bugles sounding attack calls that echoed across the water. The crossing began at multiple points simultaneously. North Korean engineers had secretly prepared underwater bridges and collected small boats during the previous week. Now they swarmed across the Naktong River, while their artillery and mortars suppressed American defensive fire. The carefully planned assault struck Freeman's extended positions with overwhelming force. Private First Class Herbert Miller, manning a machine gun position on Hill 208, watched in fascination and terror as enemy troops materialized from the river like phantoms. His weapon chattered continuously, cutting down attackers, but more kept coming. When North Korean infiltrators appeared behind his position, Miller realized the defensive line had been penetrated at multiple points. The breakthrough at the Naktong Bulge represented exactly the scenario General Walker had feared most. Enemy forces, once across the river in strength, could advance rapidly toward Miryang and threaten the vital supply lines connecting Pusan to the northern sectors of the perimeter. If the North Koreans captured this transportation hub, the entire defensive position would become untenable. Freeman radioed desperately for reinforcements and air support. The 5th Air Force responded magnificently, sending waves of F-80 Shooting Stars and F-51 Mustangs to strafe the river crossings and attack enemy armor. Navy Corsairs from Task Force 77 joined the aerial assault, their rockets and napalm creating infernos among North Korean positions. Yet air power alone could not stop the enemy advance. By noon on August 12th, North Korean forces had established a bridgehead 6 miles wide and 4 miles deep on the southern side of the Naktong River. Their T-34 tanks, supported by self-propelled artillery, pushed steadily toward Yongsan and the vital road network behind the perimeter. According to Clay Blair's definitive account in The Forgotten War, the situation became so critical that General Walker personally visited Freeman's command post to assess the crisis. The 8th Army commander found American units scattered and disorganized, many having lost contact with higher headquarters during the chaotic fighting. Walker immediately committed his limited reserves, elements of the 2nd Infantry Division just arriving from the United States. These fresh troops, though untested in Korean combat, brought desperately needed firepower and manpower to contain the breakthrough. The general also ordered massive artillery concentrations, bringing fire from every available gun in the sector. The fighting intensified throughout August 13th, as both sides fed reinforcements into the expanding battle. North Korean forces, sensing victory within their grasp, committed additional regiments to exploit their success. American units, fighting with the desperation of men who knew retreat meant destruction, held isolated positions and called down artillery fire on their own locations when overrun. Sergeant William Sitman of the 9th Infantry Regiment found himself surrounded on Hill 147 with 32 men from his company. As North Korean forces closed in from 3 directions, Sitman radioed coordinates for artillery fire directly onto his position. "We're finished anyway," he told the Fire Direction Center. "Might as well take some of them with us." The barrage that followed killed most of the attacking enemy force and allowed Sitman's survivors to withdraw. Similar scenes of desperate courage played out across the battlefield. Medical corpsmen crawled through intense fire to treat wounded soldiers. Artillery forward observers remained at their posts despite overwhelming odds, directing devastating fire against enemy concentrations. Tank crews fought their obsolete M24 Chaffee tanks against superior Soviet armor, relying on superior tactics and determination to overcome technical disadvantages. As night fell on August 13th, both armies prepared for another day of brutal combat. The North Korean breakthrough had been contained, but not eliminated. Their forces still occupied a dangerous salient that threatened the entire defensive perimeter. American casualties mounted steadily. The 23rd Infantry Regiment alone had lost over 400 men in 2 days of fighting. Walker knew that the next few days would determine whether his forces could hold the Pusan perimeter or face complete defeat. The enemy had demonstrated their capability to breach his defenses. Now his troops would have to prove their ability to counterattack and restore the line. The real test of American resolve was just beginning. General Walton Walker stood in his command bunker on the morning of August 15, 1950, studying reconnaissance photographs that showed the full extent of North Korean penetration across the Naktong River. The enemy salient bulged 6 miles into UN territory, threatening to split his forces and capture the crucial road junction at Yongsan. Time was running out. Within hours, North Korean reinforcements would transform their bridgehead into an unstoppable breakthrough. Walker's decision to launch an immediate counterattack defied conventional military doctrine. His forces were outnumbered, exhausted from continuous combat, and facing an enemy that held strong defensive positions. Yet the general understood that hesitation meant defeat. The Pusan perimeter could not survive a prolonged North Korean occupation of territory so close to vital supply lines. The counterattack plan relied heavily on American advantages in air power and artillery. The 5th Air Force concentrated every available aircraft on the Naktong sector, flying close support missions that kept enemy reinforcements from crossing the river. Navy ships offshore added their guns to the devastating barrage that preceded the ground assault. Colonel John Michaelis, commanding the 27th Infantry Regiment, received orders to spearhead the main attack against Hill 208 and Hill 311, the dominant terrain features in the North Korean salient. His regiment, though reduced to half strength by casualties, represented the most experienced American unit available for the mission. At dawn on August 16th, Michaelis launched his assault with 2 depleted battalions, advancing up opposite sides of Hill 208. The North Korean defenders, having had 48 hours to prepare positions, met the attack with devastating fire. Machine guns positioned in carefully concealed bunkers cut down the first wave of attackers, while mortars and artillery created a killing field on the exposed slopes. Lieutenant Robert Maness led his platoon up the southeastern approach, watching men fall around him as enemy fire intensified. When his radio operator was killed beside him, Maness found himself cut off from supporting artillery. Determined to maintain momentum, he gathered 20 survivors and continued the assault, using grenades and bayonets to clear North Korean positions one by one. The fighting on Hill 208 exemplified the brutal, close-quarters combat that characterized the Naktong battles. American soldiers, trained in the mechanized warfare of World War II, found themselves fighting an Asian enemy that excelled in night infiltration, camouflage, and defensive positioning. Every bunker had to be assaulted individually, every trench cleared at bayonet point. Air support proved crucial to American success. F-80 Shooting Stars, flying dangerously low to avoid hitting friendly forces, strafed enemy positions with devastating accuracy. Navy Corsairs delivered napalm strikes that incinerated entire defensive complexes. The psychological effect on North Korean troops, unaccustomed to sustained air attack, proved as important as the physical destruction. By noon on August 16th, Michaelis had gained a foothold on Hill 208, but at terrible cost. His 1st Battalion had suffered over 60% casualties, while the 2nd Battalion fared little better. North Korean counterattacks, launched with bugle calls and mass infantry assaults, threatened to overwhelm the exhausted Americans. The critical moment came when Captain Lewis Millett, leading Company E of the 27th Infantry, found his men pinned down by machine gun fire from a complex of bunkers. With ammunition running low and casualties mounting, Millett made a decision that would become legendary in military annals. "Fix bayonets," he shouted, then led a charging assault directly into the enemy positions. Millett's bayonet charge, the last successful action of its kind in American military history, broke through North Korean defenses and captured the summit of Hill 208. The sight of Americans attacking with cold steel apparently unnerved defenders who had grown confident in their defensive advantages. Within hours, the entire North Korean position on the hill collapsed. According to SLA Marshall's combat interviews documented in The River and the Gauntlet, the psychological impact of the bayonet charge extended far beyond its immediate tactical success. North Korean prisoners reported that their officers had assured them Americans would never engage in close combat, preferring to rely on firepower and technology. Millett's assault shattered that assumption and contributed to declining enemy morale throughout the sector. The success on Hill 208 triggered a general American advance across the salient. The 9th Infantry Regiment attacked Hill 311, while elements of the 5th Cavalry Regiment moved against enemy positions along the river line. North Korean forces, suddenly facing coordinated attacks from multiple directions, began showing signs of the strain. Tank support proved decisive in several engagements. The newly arrived M26 Pershing tanks, with their 90mm guns, could finally engage Soviet T-34 tanks on equal terms. Tank versus tank duels raged across the battlefield as American armor supported infantry attacks against fortified positions. As evening approached on August 17th, Walker's forces had regained most of the territory lost during the initial North Korean breakthrough. Enemy forces still held positions along the river, but their salient had been reduced and their offensive capability blunted. The counterattack had succeeded, but at enormous cost. American casualties for the three-day battle exceeded 800 killed and wounded. The fighting at the Nakhtong Bulge proved that United Nations forces could not only defend the perimeter, but also mount effective counterattacks against enemy penetrations. More importantly, it demonstrated to both sides that the war would not end with a quick North Korean victory. The real struggle for Korea was just beginning. The morning of August 20th, 1950, brought no respite to the defenders of the Pusan perimeter. While smoke still rose from the Nakhtong Bulge battles, North Korean forces launched simultaneous attacks against the northern and eastern sectors, testing every mile of the overstretched defensive line. General Walker faced his greatest crisis yet, a coordinated offensive that threatened to shatter his forces at multiple points. Colonel Harold Moore, commanding the 8th Cavalry Regiment near Daegu, received the first reports of massive enemy concentrations moving south through the mountain passes. Intelligence estimates suggested at least 2 North Korean divisions, the 1st and 13th, advancing toward the crucial communications hub that served as the nerve center for the entire perimeter defense. Daegu's strategic importance could hardly be overstated. The city served as headquarters for the Republic of Korea Army, housed critical supply depots, and controlled the road and rail networks connecting all sectors of the perimeter. Its capture would split Walker's forces into isolated pockets and make coordinated defense impossible. The North Korean assault on Daegu began with a massive artillery barrage at 0300 hours on August 21st. Enemy guns, carefully positioned in the mountains north of the city, rained shells down on American positions with devastating accuracy. The bombardment continued for 2 hours, destroying communication lines and creating chaos among defending units. As the artillery lifted, waves of North Korean infantry emerged from the mountain valleys like a human avalanche. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, the main force advancing down the Seoul-Pusan highway, while secondary columns infiltrated through mountain trails to strike the defenders' flanks and rear. Moore's cavalry regiment, fighting as infantry, faced odds of nearly 4-1. His men occupied hastily prepared positions on the hills surrounding Daegu, their fields of fire carefully planned, but their defensive line dangerously thin. Every soldier understood that retreat from these positions meant abandoning the entire northern sector of the perimeter. The fighting for Hill 303, dominating the northern approaches to Daegu, became legendary for its intensity. Company F of the 8th Cavalry, commanded by Captain William Weber, held the summit against repeated North Korean attacks. Weber's men, numbering fewer than 80 at the battle's start, faced human wave assaults that continued throughout the day and into the night. Sergeant First Class William Windrich, a World War II veteran, manned a machine gun position that became the focal point of North Korean attacks. As enemy forces swarmed up the hillside, Windrich's weapon cut down attacking soldiers in windrows. When his ammunition ran low, he called for artillery fire on his own position, staying at his gun until the last possible moment before the barrage fell. Simultaneously, the eastern sector of the perimeter erupted in combat, as North Korean forces launched their assault on Pohang and the vital airfield that served as a forward base for American air operations. The loss of Pohang would eliminate close air support for ground forces and provide the enemy with a major port facility for receiving supplies. The 3rd Battalion, 29th Infantry Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Harold Murch, defended the approaches to Pohang against elements of the North Korean 5th Division. These enemy troops, fresh and well-equipped, attacked with the confidence of soldiers who had swept everything before them for 3 months. The battle for Pohang Airfield demonstrated the critical importance of air-ground cooperation in modern warfare. As North Korean forces approached the runway, American aircraft took off under fire, their pilots executing combat missions while ground crews loaded ammunition and fuel under intense enemy bombardment. Captain James Houseman, an advisor with South Korean forces, witnessed one of the war's most remarkable scenes as ROK troops fought alongside their American allies to hold the airfield perimeter. Despite language barriers and equipment shortages, Korean soldiers displayed extraordinary courage, often attacking enemy positions with little more than rifles and grenades. The crisis reached its peak on August 22nd, when North Korean forces penetrated to within artillery range of both Taegu and Pohang. Walker's command bunker received reports of enemy tanks approaching the outskirts of Taegu, while North Korean infantry occupied positions overlooking Pohang airfield. Air power again proved decisive. The 5th Air Force, recognizing the critical nature of the situation, committed every available aircraft to stopping the enemy advance. F-80 jets, flying continuous missions despite pilot fatigue, struck North Korean columns advancing toward both objectives. Navy aircraft from Task Force 77 joined the aerial assault, their napalm strikes creating walls of fire across enemy approach routes. The turning point came when newly arrived B-29 superfortresses, flying from bases in Japan, carpet-bombed North Korean troop concentrations north of Taegu. The massive 4-engine bombers designed for strategic missions against industrial targets proved devastatingly effective against massed infantry formations. Their 1,000-pound bombs created craters that channeled subsequent enemy attacks into killing zones covered by American artillery. Artillery support reached unprecedented levels of concentration and accuracy. The entire northern sector of the perimeter became a killing field, as American guns, firing continuously for 48 hours, broke up every enemy assault before it could reach defensive positions. Forward observers, often surrounded by enemy forces, continued calling in fire missions that sometimes landed within 50 meters of their positions. As reports filtered back from the battlefield, Walker realized his forces had weathered their severest test. North Korean casualties in the northern offensive exceeded 5,000 killed and wounded, while American losses, though significant, remained manageable. The enemy had shot their bolt. Their best divisions had been committed and repulsed with enormous losses. The successful defense of both Taegu and Pohang proved that the Pusan perimeter could withstand coordinated attacks from multiple directions. More importantly, it demonstrated that North Korean forces, despite their numerical superiority and recent victories, had reached the limits of their offensive capability. The tide of war was beginning to turn, though few participants recognized it at the time. By August 28, 1950, the North Korean People's Army had thrown everything they possessed against the Pusan perimeter in a final, desperate attempt to achieve total victory. General Walker surveyed his battle maps with grim satisfaction, noting that every major enemy offensive had been repulsed, but at costs that brought his forces to the breaking point. The question now was whether either army possessed the strength for one more decisive engagement. The statistics told the story of a brutal month of warfare. North Korean forces had suffered an estimated 25,000 casualties since beginning their August offensive, with entire regiments reduced to company strength. Their tank force, so dominant during the initial invasion, had been decimated by American air attacks and the arrival of heavier Allied armor. Most critically, their supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, could no longer support sustained operations. Yet Walker's forces had paid an equally terrible price for their successful defense. American battle casualties exceeded 6,000, with some regiments down to 40% of authorized strength. The constant combat had exhausted units that had been fighting continuously for 2 months. Ammunition expenditures had reached levels that strained the entire Pacific supply system. Colonel Ned Moore, now commanding a composite force formed from the remnants of 3 different regiments, epitomized the situation facing UN forces throughout the perimeter. His unit, officially designated as the 5th Regimental Combat Team, consisted of survivors from units that had been shattered in previous battles, hastily trained replacements fresh from the United States, and South Korean soldiers integrated into American formations. The final North Korean offensive began on September 1st, 1950, with characteristic massive artillery preparation. Enemy commanders, recognizing their deteriorating position, had concentrated their remaining strength for one last attempt to break through the perimeter. This time, they chose the Naktong Bulge as their primary objective, hoping to exploit their intimate knowledge of terrain, where they had achieved initial success. The second battle of the Naktong Bulge opened with the most intensive artillery barrage North Korean forces had yet delivered. Their guns, many captured from retreating South Korean forces earlier in the war, hammered American positions along a 10-mile front. The bombardment continued for 3 hours, creating a moonscape of craters and destroyed fortifications. As the barrage lifted, North Korean assault troops advanced across the Naktong River at multiple crossing points. Unlike their previous attacks, which had relied on stealth and infiltration, this assault came in broad daylight with maximum force. Enemy commanders had apparently concluded that speed and violence of action represented their only hope for success. The defenders, now veterans of previous Naktong battles, had learned hard lessons about fighting this particular enemy. American positions featured interlocking fields of fire, carefully planned artillery concentrations, and immediate access to air support. Every river crossing site had been plotted and registered by multiple artillery batteries. Staff Sergeant Ernest Kuma, commanding an M26 Pershing tank positioned on Hill 117, watched through his periscope as hundreds of North Korean soldiers swarmed across the river below. His tank, one of only 6 Pershings available in the sector, represented crucial firepower that could break up enemy formations before they consolidated their bridgehead. Kuma's tank engagement became one of the most remarkable individual actions of the Korean War. Fighting from a stationary position, he systematically destroyed enemy strongpoints, knocked out artillery pieces, and broke up infantry attacks. When his tank's main gun malfunctioned, Kuma climbed onto the turret under intense fire to clear the jam, then continued fighting until his ammunition was exhausted. The air battle reached unprecedented intensity as both sides committed their maximum available strength. North Korean aircraft, largely absent from previous engagements, appeared in significant numbers for the first time since the war's opening weeks. Soviet-built Yak fighters and Il-10 ground attack aircraft challenged American air superiority in desperate battles over the battlefield. American pilots, flying F-80 jets and F-51 Mustangs, found themselves engaged in old-fashioned dogfights, while simultaneously providing close support to ground forces. The sky over the Naktong became a 3-dimensional battlefield, where air combat merged with surface action in unprecedented complexity. Major John Glenn, flying an F-80 with the 335th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, shot down 2 North Korean aircraft while leading a close support mission against enemy river crossings. His experience illustrated the multifaceted nature of air operations. One moment engaging enemy fighters, the next strafing ground targets with deadly accuracy. The crisis peaked on September 3rd, when North Korean forces achieved their deepest penetration of the war advancing to within artillery range of the vital supply hub at Miryang. Walker committed his final reserves, elements of the recently arrived 2nd Infantry Division and the British 27th Brigade, in a desperate counterattack to contain the breakthrough. The counterattack succeeded, but barely. British forces, fighting their first major engagement of the war, distinguished themselves in vicious close combat that cleared North Korean positions, hill by hill. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, advancing behind bagpipers playing traditional Scottish airs, achieved what would become the most famous small unit action involving British forces in Korea. As September 4th dawned, both armies had reached the limits of endurance. North Korean forces, having failed to achieve breakthrough despite committing their strategic reserves, began showing signs of disintegration. Prisoner interrogations revealed units abandoning positions, widespread desertion, and complete breakdown of supply systems. Walker's forces, though victorious, were equally exhausted. Medical reports indicated combat fatigue among units that had been fighting continuously for over 2 months. Ammunition stocks had dropped to critically low levels despite maximum supply efforts from Japan and the United States. The Battle of Pusan perimeter was entering its final phase. Both sides had demonstrated remarkable courage and endurance, but the mathematics of warfare were inexorable. The North Korean People's Army, having failed to achieve quick victory, faced the prospect of fighting a prolonged war against an enemy with vastly superior industrial capacity and logistical capabilities. The question was no longer whether UN forces would survive. It was how quickly they could transition from defense to offense. The morning of September 8, 1950, brought an unusual quiet to the Pusan perimeter. For the first time in nearly a month, the thunder of artillery had ceased, and the constant buzz of aircraft overhead had diminished to routine patrols. General Walker, studying intelligence reports in his command bunker, recognized the signs that military historians would later identify as the decisive turning point of the Korean War. North Korean forces, having exhausted themselves in repeated failed offensives, were beginning a general withdrawal from positions around the perimeter. Prisoner interrogations revealed a catastrophic breakdown in enemy morale and supply systems. Units that had fought with desperate courage for 2 months were abandoning their weapons and fleeing northward in growing numbers. The statistics of the North Korean collapse were staggering. Intelligence estimates suggested enemy forces had suffered over 50,000 casualties since beginning their August offensive, nearly half their original strength. More critically, their combat effectiveness had been destroyed by the loss of experienced junior officers and non-commissioned officers who formed the backbone of any military organization. Colonel Paul Freeman, whose 23rd Infantry Regiment had borne the brunt of fighting at the Naktong Bulge, received orders that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier: pursue and destroy withdrawing enemy forces. His regiment, rebuilt with replacements and now supported by additional armor and artillery, prepared to transition from desperate defense to aggressive pursuit. The pursuit phase revealed the complete transformation in military fortunes. American forces that had fought desperately to hold individual hills now advanced rapidly across terrain they had defended with such difficulty. North Korean resistance, when encountered, proved sporadic and poorly coordinated. The disciplined army that had conquered most of Korea in 2 months had disintegrated into scattered groups of demoralized soldiers. Air power played a devastating role in the destruction of retreating North Korean forces. The 5th Air Force, no longer needed for close support of defensive positions, ranged far behind enemy lines to attack supply columns, communication centers, and troop concentrations. The highways leading north became killing grounds where American aircraft destroyed thousands of vehicles and eliminated entire units caught in the open. Captain Robinson Reisner, flying an F-80 with the 36th Fighter Bomber Squadron, described the scene along the Seoul-Pusan Highway as resembling a giant junkyard filled with destroyed North Korean equipment. His squadron alone claimed over 200 vehicles destroyed in a single day of operations, contributing to the complete breakdown of enemy logistics. The human cost of the North Korean defeat became apparent as UN forces advanced into territory that had been under enemy control. Towns and villages showed evidence of systematic looting and destruction. More disturbing were the reports of massacres, evidence that North Korean forces had executed prisoners and civilians before retreating. The liberation of these areas also revealed the extent of North Korean losses. Abandoned equipment littered the countryside, artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, and small arms left behind by forces fleeing too rapidly to maintain their heavy weapons. American intelligence officers estimated that the North Korean People's Army had lost over 60% of its original equipment during the Pusan perimeter campaign. Walker's success at Pusan perimeter had broader strategic implications that extended far beyond Korea. The successful defense demonstrated to the world that United Nations forces could stand against communist aggression, providing a crucial boost to Western morale during the early Cold War period. More practically, it had preserved the staging area that would soon launch the Incheon landing and drive North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel. The final phase of the perimeter defense also showcased the effectiveness of international cooperation under United Nations auspices. American, British, Turkish, Philippine, and South Korean forces had fought as a cohesive unit, demonstrating that collective security could work in practice. This success would provide the template for future NATO operations and other alliance structures. According to historian William Stueck's analysis in The Korean War and International History, the victory at Pusan perimeter marked the first successful Western military response to communist expansion since World War II ended. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. Western democracies gained confidence in their ability to resist communist aggression, while communist planners were forced to reconsider their assumptions about Western resolve. By September 15, 1950, the situation had completely reversed. North Korean forces were in full retreat toward the 38th parallel, abandoning most of South Korea without serious resistance. UN forces, reinforced by arriving American divisions and preparing for General MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon, were poised to pursue their defeated enemies deep into North Korean territory.